You're watching Act TV. I'm Julianna Forlano. Now that the movement to defund the police is catching fire, changemakers are taking a close look at all of our institutions that do more to destroy communities than build them up. Joe Cirincione has been looking at the United States prioritization of weapons over people. He's here to talk about how we can flip the script and put money that we're currently wasting on deadly weapons into relief programs. Joe is the president of the Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation. He's the host of Press the Button, the weekly podcast from the Ploughshares Fund, dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. He is also the author of the books Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late, and Bomb Scare, the history and future of nuclear weapons and deadly arsenals, nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. How do you not stay up all night, Joe, when you're writing these books?
These are all romance novels.
Well, I like the title of the first one about how before it's too late. I kind of was wondering how close we are to the detonation clock. What with Trump in the office, it's quite frightening. Can you talk about where we are in terms of that before we go into this other topic?
Sure. In fact, my colleague Tom Collina has an op-ed in the New York Times that was just printed yesterday with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. And the two of them warn that we are close. We are close because the system that we set up during the Cold War allows for one man and one man only, the president, to authorize the use of nuclear weapons. And once he makes that decision, which he can make for any reason whatsoever, without consultation, no one can stop him. So you don't need the approval of the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Certainly there's no consultations with Congress. There's no time for a brief at the Supreme Court. You have one man with ultimate authority that can launch 1,000 nuclear weapons at figuratively at the press of the button. He makes a phone call and he orders the launch. And we have all our weapons configured to go off within 5 minutes of an order. So this is instant. There's no consultation. And they're warning this system is totally out of date. It was never a smart idea in the first place, but the instability of our current president exposes the insanity of this system. The only thing that's standing between us and nuclear holocaust is Donald Trump's brain. That is not a situation you want to be in. We have to fix this as soon as we can. It may be impossible while he's president, but if he is defeated in November, this should be high up on the list of changes to make.
I've heard people exclaim that how fearful they are that if he is defeated in November, a rebuke of a narcissistic personality, those months between November 15th and January 20th could actually be quite tenuous in this area. Your thoughts about that? I
completely agree. This is a man who does not want to go peacefully. And remember, once he is no longer president, his immunity from prosecution ends. So there's a lot at stake here for the president personally, his family, his business. So I expect that he's going to try to cling to power through any means necessary. And so that's why, his actions during the Black Lives Matter protests concern me. Who are these unmarked police forces that are coming to the demonstrations? Who do they answer to? What about these National Guards that he brought in from faraway states? I'm concerned about that, but also about the possibility that he could legally, within the existing processes, fabricate or instigate a national emergency that could give him the argument to suspend the Constitution. And then, therefore, on January 21st, 2021, Joe Biden might not be inaugurated as president because he would say there's a national emergency. We can't risk this. Those are the kinds of situations above and beyond the other things we're talking about, voter suppression, rigging of the ballots, the intrinsic imbalance of the Electoral College. There's a lot to worry about. This is not going to be a clean and simple election or transfer of power.
I'm terrified. Right before you, the DACA person was on from United We Dream. We were kind of celebrating the good news, the stay of execution from the Supreme Court. And now we're back to reality in terms of just how close we are to nuclear annihilation. Do you think that other people in his, please give me some hope, Joe, is there, I know he has his finger on the button and he likes to sow discord and chaos, and this would certainly do it. Do you think, number one, that Donald Trump knows he's allowed to do that? And do you think that, that there are other mitigating factors that would stop him, even in that, the fact that he really does have the power to do it on his own?
Yes and no. Yes, he knows that he has the power to do this. And you may remember at the very beginning of his presidency, he was ratcheting up the pressure on Kim Jong-un of North Korea. And he got into this Twitter rant about fire and fury, right? And about the button in particular, because Kim Jong-un was talking about his ability to develop North Korea's nuclear weapons. And he says, I have a bigger button than he does, and mine works. So yes, he knows this. In fact, it's the very first thing that a new president is instructed on. Right after he takes the oath of office, he's brought back from that balcony at the Capitol, brought into a room, and the transfer of the nuclear codes takes place. And so 24/7, there is an officer that follows him, required to be within 1 minute of him at all times, carrying this big black briefcase. And in that are the nuclear codes and the communications, the ability to communicate quickly with the what they call the National Command Authority that can launch the weapons. So Trump knows this. It's a very simple brief. It doesn't take long. He just is told that he can do this. So yes, he knows it. And it's an open question about whether he understands what this would mean. And when if you're dealing with somebody with a malignant narcissistic personality that doesn't care about anybody else, that doesn't have empathy, look how he's responded to the COVID pandemic. His loss of power is what would matter to him, not the lives of millions of other people. So yes, this is an unprecedented situation in U.S. nuclear history. We've had many close calls before, but almost always the President of the United States has considered rational and unlikely to take an insane action. The one exception to that is Richard Nixon, right before he was impeached, was drunk and wandering the halls of the White House, talking to the pictures on the wall. And Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was so concerned that he told the military officers, if the president gives you an order, check with me first.
Oh, I hope there's somebody up there doing that.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the situation we're in. It's scarier than people realize.
Do you believe that the international community is aware and terrified like we all are now?
I think you've seen repeatedly U.S. allies try a variety of approaches to walk the president off the edge. For example, just 2 years ago, the president pulled out of the effective working anti-nuclear deal with Iran. This was a deal that had rolled back Iran's program, froze it, and put it under a microscope for a generation, 20, 25 years, frozen in place. They sent the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel. They sent the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson at the time. The President of France, Emmanuel Macron, came, and they all tried to convince the president, don't do this. It's working. Or all our allies want to keep this deal. But they made the mistake of bringing facts to a post-policy debate,
just compliments is all they needed to bring. Compliments, not facts.
Well, they tried that too. Oh. And it didn't work. And he pulled out of the deal and we're more dangerous for it. Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon now than they were when he pulled out of the deal because they've been slowly breaking out of the constraints themselves. So no, there is no, the allies understand this and they haven't found an effective way to deal with it. They are counting the days to the U.S. election, just as many of
yes, well, I'm in New York, so today I'm going to be voting in the primary and getting my voting finger and thumb ready for November, getting it primed up. Let's talk a little bit about how we got to the place we are right now, which is so much money going for weapons of war and so little for social programs. How did we get here?
9/11. 9/11 is the basic reason. I mean, you can go back further, but let's just take the last 20 years, which is sort of in the realm of experience of many of your listeners, perhaps. There's been a lot of people writing about this recently, about the need to close the chapter, close the door on the 9/11 era. But if you just look at the military budget in September 10th of 2001, we were spending $300 billion on the military, on the Pentagon, $300 billion. That was a lot of money. We still had all the bases. We had allied systems. We had a very large Army, Navy, Air Force, et cetera. 300 billion. We are now spending, the Congress is about to vote in the next couple of months on a new budget that is 150% higher, 740 billion. So it was 300, now it's 740 billion, about 20 years, 19 years later. What explains that? The Iraq War, the Afghan War, these wars of choice that we waged with disastrous effect in the Middle East. And in the process, when you are at war, you remember how the country gets. You know, we're always honoring the troops, which we should. We have flyovers at our ball games, at our Super Bowls. We have Memorial Day parades, and everything is patriotic. Everything is wrapped in flags, including the contracts. And the contracts just surged, and every program surged. And by the way, just a link to the protests we're seeing. If you wonder where the police get all these military vehicles, they get them from the Pentagon. The defense contractors practice their own form of planned obsolescence. They want to get rid of the weapons that they currently have to make room for new weapons. So they basically are giving free to many police forces armored vehicles, armored vests, machine guns, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was a program that was started during these past 20 years to move weapons out of the Pentagon into the police forces. And we end up in the situation where we are now. This is, to Barbara Lee and Bernie Sanders' point, $740 billion is more than we spent during the Korean War, during the Vietnam War, during the Reagan buildup. In fact, it's more than almost any year since the end of World War II. And why? What is the justification for this amount of money? And the answer is contracts. The answer is that the defense industry has wired the system, or some would say they've rigged the system. The defense contractors number some 727 defense lobbyists in Washington. The defense industry spent about $130 million on those lobbyists each year. And that buys a lot of influence. And there were more defense lobbyists than there are members of Congress. So they're all getting hit up, and they overwhelm the people who want to turn our swords into plowshares, for example. So it's not really even a fair fight. And it's wired. And can I give you just one example?
Absolutely.
Yesterday, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee marked up their portion of the bill. So this is a committee that does the nuclear forces. It's headed by a man named Jim Cooper from Tennessee, a good man, man. But
sometimes I hear Tennessee,
there was no amendments to that bill. They just basically rubber stamped the Pentagon's request. No amendments, no discussion. The whole markup took 10 minutes. And part of the reason for that is that Jim Cooper, who's facing his own primary challenge, is beholden to the defense contractors. 3 of his top 5 campaign contributors are nuclear weapons contractors, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin included. And so you can see there was this system that's been built up. My friend Gordon Adams calls it the iron triangle of the defense contractors, the Pentagon, and Congress. And they are just locked in, and they support each other. And you really have to take a real hammer to that system in order to break that grip. That's the kind of thing Barbara Lee and Senator Sanders are doing. They understand the moment. They understand that this pandemic crisis, the economic collapse, and now the demands for social justice are combining, and that just might be enough to finally break that grip, end this escalation of defense spending, flatten that curve, and turn it back down so we can get back to something like $300 billion. So you can see where Barbara Lee is getting these numbers. They're not just pulled out of a hat. You can go back to that 2001 budget, that 2000 budget, where we were fine. We still had the largest military in the world by far. We're still spending more on military than the next 8 to 10 nations combined. So you can get security, you can be safe at a much lower price. The difference is the defense contractors won't be making as much profit.
Have you seen the beast raise its head now that Barbara Lee and Bernie Sanders have proposed this? I'm assuming there's going to be lots of pushback on the Hill.
Well, okay, this is tricky. So yes, there's pushback on the Hill, and yes, I've seen that. Let me tell you just one sort of anecdote. When I was a young staffer on the House Armed Services Committee in the 1980s, I'm old. I was a young liberal activist staffer, and I was working for an old conservative member from Jacksonville, Florida, who wanted to cut the nuclear weapons budget. This guy wanted to keep the defense budget high. He thought nuclear weapons were a waste. He wanted to build more ships. So I'm working on amendments. I'm proposing oversight. I'm ordering GAO reports. We're bringing bills to the floor. And a senior member of the committee, senior staffer, comes over to me, puts his arm around me and says, Joe, 95% of what we do here is keep the money going. The sooner you learn that, the sooner you will fit in. I understood exactly what he was saying. He was not criticizing me. He was trying to help me. He was trying to help me understand the system that I was now a part of. I never really learned that lesson, you know, whether inside or outside. But that's the mechanism that goes on in Congress. And it dovetails with the politics. So why did the subcommittee, Mark, not cut, for example, the ICBM? The Air Force is trying to ram through a new ICBM. It's early in its development. They're trying to lock in the contract so the next president will have a tougher time canceling it. They've tripled the budget request from last year, from 500 million to 1.5 billion. They want to lock it in. They understand the game. Why didn't the subcommittee cut that? Why won't there be cuts to the budget when the House Armed Services Committee meets later this week, led by a very good man, Adam Smith from Washington State? Because the Democrats basically don't want to have this fight. They have made the calculation that they are better off not having a fight on defense that would make difficult votes for some of their vulnerable members up for re-election. You know better than most that there are about 40 new members of Congress that came from swing districts. So the leadership, and again, these are good people. They're not crooks. You know, they're not like, they're good people, but they're making
not like some of those other ones.
but they're making a political calculation that they would rather not have this fight in order to protect those seats so that they can have those votes to fight for other things that they care about more, like domestic programs, well, like DACA and things like that. And that's the political calculation. So it's this combination of the corruption of the money and the politics that Democrats play. I think they're wrong. I think Barbara Lee and Bernie Sanders have their finger on the pulse of America better than these leaders do. I think Americans would welcome reasonable cuts to defense. It's supportable. I don't think any member of Congress would lose their seat. But these are political views that have been formed over decades, and they're very hard to break, and the Democrats are very timid.
Oh, well, that's putting it mildly. We're speaking with Joe Cirincione, President of the Ploughshares Fund. Joe, you said that you worked on nuclear weapons policy in Washington for over 35 years, 9 of them as professional staff in the U.S. House of Representatives, Committee on Armed Services and Government Operations. From your experience, do you think it's politically possible to, in any other way other than electorally, to divert funds away from the Pentagon and into social programs? There's a call on the streets now to divert away from police. Can we also, ramp that up a bit?
I think there's a connection. I think there's a connection between demilitarizing the police and demilitarizing our national security. And in fact, if you look, you will see that more and more voices are calling for rethinking national security, redefining national security. This has come since the pandemic. And it includes liberals like my friend Ben Rhodes, former Deputy National Security Advisor for Barack Obama, who writes a brilliant piece in the Atlantic in the middle of April, saying it's basically that this is all a distortion from our overreaction to 9/11. It's time to rethink national security. The threats we face are not military. Jessica Matthews, my former boss at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, writes a brilliant article in the New York Review of Books last July, saying we're spending way too much. This is insane. We've got to break this cycle. And even conservatives like Max Boot, he's a known neocon, a self-described defense hawk, a real cheerleader for the war in Iraq. He writes at the end of March 31st in the Washington Post, we have to rethink national security. That all the threats we faced in the 20 years have not been primarily military. And he includes the Iraq and Afghanistan in that. But that's nation building. And we proved that we don't know how to do it. We've had an economic crisis in 2008 that is not military. We have a pandemic now. We have Russian interference in our elections. The major threats we face are not military. We have to reorient our budget. So you're starting to see this current develop in the intelligentsia, in the liberal class, in accepted members of the Washington national security community. And now you have this upsurge from the bottom. And this is what gives me so great hope. I think we probably agree that real change comes from the bottom up. So, you've got to have this. You've got to have this. And this is now the biggest, most sweeping, most sustained mass movement I've ever seen in America. And I go back to the Vietnam War days, the Civil Rights days. I was a labor organizer, the women's movement. These have been big movements, big important movements that achieved real gains, but they pale in comparison to what's going on now. And it's happening on multiple fronts: climate change, gun control, economic inequities, social justice, civil rights. It's moving. There are more people engaged in the political life of this country than I've ever seen. And that's what gives me hope, that power can translate. You can't, you still have to translate it into our political system. You have to elect people who will agree with this. You have to then force them to do what they said they would do, right? Like
And
FDR
don't just
said,
sit back.
I agree with what you say. Now go make me do it. You have to go make them do it. And so the mass movement is the critical factor. And so that gives me hope that we can turn the corner on this defense spending, demilitarize our national security as well as our police force.
If Trump has done anything, it's gotten people out of their complacency, especially people anywhere to the left of center at all, I think. So that's a plus. Does Trump have the same kind of monetary connections to the defense industry that, say, George Bush and Dick Cheney did? Because they were making a lot of money selling arms. I don't know about that.
Right. Dick Cheney, of course, was the former official in Halliburton, a major defense contractor, And as far as I know, Donald Trump does not have any direct investments or companies that do military equipment that would be considered defense contractors. His corruption is a little different. He has financial interests in many states, for example, Saudi Arabia. Why does he take his first trip as president to Saudi Arabia? Because his family is heavily invested in Saudi Arabia. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, is looking for finance from the Saudi families. And so in that arrangement, one of the things that the Saudis want, and one of the things that defense contractors want, is to sell billions of dollars worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is waging a brutal war against the people of Yemen now that's been going on for almost 5 years, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent Yemenis. Donald Trump facilitates that. He gloats about it. Maybe you remember that White House photo with him and the Saudi prince holding up a big check representing how much Saudi Arabia was going to buy in U.S. arms. So his interests are sort of secondary, right? He's not making money from the actual sale of the weapons. He's making money from the good relations he has with the Saudi family, and that will then allow him to conduct his businesses and his son-in-law's businesses. That's the connection that he has. And he believes that this is good for him politically because it generates jobs in the United States. And military spending does generate jobs. Many studies have shown that if you took that same dollar and instead of buying weapons for it, built a school, you'd have 3 times the economic impact. You would generate 3 times the amount of jobs from investing that money in hospitals, in schools, infrastructure, roads, etc. So that's part of the drive behind Barbara Lee's bill too, is take the money from sort of dead end investment, buying weapons, and put it into social investment, building schools, building roads, and the economy will benefit from
well, I think now's the time, and I appreciate you coming on the program to talk about this, because I'm not sure, it's raising through the din of what's happening on the mainstream news, what with coronavirus and civil unrest happening in our streets in America. So thank you so much for coming on and for the work that you do. Talk a bit about the Ploughshares Fund and what people can do to support the work that you do there.
Sure. The Ploughshares Fund is an independent foundation. We raise money from generous people and then grant it out to people who are working on nuclear weapons issues, trying to cut the arsenal, cut the budget, cut the risks. So if you either have money or need money, you should go to ploughshares.org. It's spelled the English way, P-L-O-U-G-H, ploughshares.org. Take a look at what we do. You can learn about the groups we support. You can fund them directly, $10, $10,000. It all helps. It all matters. Or donate it to Ploughshares, and we will be your mutual fund. We will give it out to 100 or more groups every year, making sure that the frontline activists and advocates and experts have the resources they need to do the job to wage the good fight.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the program. We've been speaking with Joe Cirincione, President of Ploughshares Fund. You can follow him on Twitter at Cirincione, C-I-R-I-N.
C-I-O-N-E. You got it. You're almost there. You're halfway there. You were
like test the thing I'm reading off. Or you can follow Ploughshares at plow_shares, and you can follow the podcast at Press Button Pod. What's coming up on this week's episode? Oh,
wow. We have a great podcast this week. So if you're going to start listening to the podcast, listen to this one. We interview Steve Bannon, who's the producer of the Rachel Maddow Show.
Yeah.
And he has a great new book called The Imposters. And it's all about how the Republican Party gave up being a governing party and became what he calls a post-policy party. Facts don't matter. It's all about maintaining their grip on power. And he explains this in great detail. The Imposter, Steve Bannon, B-E-N-E-N. You can listen to the podcast, but go buy the book. Buy Bannon, not Bolton.
Oh, or Bannon, any of those. No.
Bannon, B-E-N-E-N. He's the good guy, not Steve Bannon.
I know we're kind of done here, but the fact that you brought up Bolton, the fact that Bolton wrote this book, I mean, he's someone that's so untrustworthy and such a warmonger, and now all of a sudden he's talking about Trump in a way that one would say, yeah, this is probably true. What do you make of this? It's kind of
okay. So this is sort of the clash. I mean, I make a little appearance in his book. He not by name exactly, but he calls me out. He calls me the high priest of arms control.
Hey, what a nice label that is.
The high priest of arms control labeled him a treaty killer, which I did in an op-ed in the Washington Post. And he says, I take that as a badge of honor. Exactly. So Bolton represents the traditional hardline conservative ideological position, and he sees, which is basically to use the military as the first tool of U.S. policy, not as a tool of last resort. So invade Iran, attack North Korea. He wants to go further. The Iraq War taught him nothing except that we didn't do it hard enough. And so he sees Trump as an impediment to that agenda. What ticks him off? What's the one thing in the book that makes him want to quit? It's Trump's refusal to attack Iran. In fact, he mentions Iran over 200 times in this book. He's obsessed with Iran, and he's furious at Trump for not waging war. So that's why Bolton is breaking with Trump, not because he's afraid that Trump will drag us into unnecessary wars, because he won't drag us into unnecessary wars.
Well, that's a plus. Okay. Well, this whole thing is mind-boggling, honestly.
Well, thank you for taking the time to talk about it. It's important stuff.
Thank you, Joe. No, I really appreciate it, and we'll hope you come back on with us soon. Thank you so much.
I'm not going anywhere. Call me anytime.
Excellent.